The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. I'm extremely pleased to have Dr. Ethan Russo back on the show. Ethan was on a few weeks ago. For those who didn't catch it, Ethan is deeply involved in the medical cannabis and botanical therapeutics sector, both as a physician and a researcher. Widely respected as one of the world's real thought leaders in this space, has had many roles within cannabis, including working with GW Pharma, and has recently started his own business called Credo Science. Ethan, welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming on again. I just realized the last time we talked, I didn't even talk about whether you'd been working on anything COVID related at the moment.
Sure. Well, it comes up in conversation all the time. There's been a lot of conjecture about whether cannabis preparations would have a role in treatment. I think that this is all premature at this point. There are theoretical bases for thinking that might be some help in certain situations, but that's far from proven at this point. I've been asked the question a lot. The only thing I'm doing that's obviously COVID related is we are working on a cannabis-based household disinfectant that should effectively kill the virus, but it would have nothing to do with treatment once somebody was sick.
Right. Fantastic. Okay, cool. And good to have that healthy note of balance to everyone is very excited thinking cannabis can solve everything. But as you say, that's not quite the case yet with COVID.
Yeah, more research needed, as they always say.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, look, Ethan, the reason I got you back in, and I'm really glad that you agreed to come on, was when I was editing the show that we did last time on terpenes, it just got me thinking about loads of stuff. And one of the things we talked about was land races, and I think a lot about environment. And I thought the topic of evolution was quite a good one in relation to cannabis. Effectively, why are things the way they are and what sort of created that? So that's the kind of headline topic. And I guess it's, things are there for a reason. What are those reasons? But maybe we just take a brief step back and some really basic stuff. If you could explain, this is going to sound really massive question, but a high level, what exactly evolution is in relation to how plants and animals develop.
Sure. Well, it's been a steady progression from the sea to land. Plants were around earlier than animals for the most part. But to put this in context, we know that the endocannabinoid system has been present in animals, those with a notochord or with a backbone, but everything down to tunicates, sea squirts. So from an evolutionary standpoint, the endocannabinoid system has been present for 600 million years. Okay. Wow. Humans themselves, it's a few million years at most. There have been other hominids. The cannabis plant itself is 30 million years old. So it is a lot younger than the endocannabinoid system and a great deal older than humans. So specifically, the fact that cannabis has within it all these chemicals that affect the endocannabinoid system is a happy accident of nature. Plants don't have an endocannabinoid system per se. So the reason that these things are in the plants is for their ecological protection. For example, THC may have a role in preventing ultraviolet light damage, which could affect the DNA sequencing of the plant and produce mutations if the light pressure were too great. That's one example. THCA and other of the cannabinoid acids are insecticidal. So if we look closely why these things are, it should be mentioned that these take a lot of metabolic energy for the plants to produce. So we can't say that it's accident. Nature is very conservative of its resources and wouldn't be investing this energy in making this profusion of chemicals unless they had a role that would advance the species, its protection, its survival. And that, in fact, is the case. So, for example, the cannabinoids And terpenoids can have anti-inflammatory properties, antibiotic properties. Particularly the terpenoids can attract good bugs. They can repel bad bugs. Again, some are insecticidal. So, we're just making good use of the fact that these chemicals are there. It has been the case in more recent times, for as long as we can document, that there's been a sort of coevolution of cannabis and humans, in that cannabis is what's known as a camp follower. If we look in Asia and places where cannabis has been, they've followed the nomadic peregrinations of humans, usually along water courses. Cannabis prefers a loamy soil next to water, and that would certainly be the case in river valleys. And these were often the routes that people would take as they were hunting, gathering, or whatever. So it's certain that humans have influenced the evolution of cannabis more recently. In fact, it's become a question as to whether there is any wild cannabis at this point. Additionally, if we look at the work of John McPartland in particular, it's really fascinating. We've always said that cannabis originated in Central Asia, and that likely is the case, but it is apparent from work that's been done on pollen samples that cannabis was indigenous to Europe. It wasn't just brought there more recently. Commonly it's been said that there are samples that could be 8,000 years old in Europe. And the supposition had been that they'd been brought there by people, but in fact, the archaeological evidence based on pollen deposits would indicate that cannabis has been in Europe and the rest of Eurasia for far, far longer than there have been humans. But these things come and go. It's subject to, it may have been in one spot, then the ice age hit, couldn't grow, but there have been relict, RELICT, evidence of long-standing, again, much longer than human habitation.
Yeah, really interesting. There's loads there I want to get into. I guess, maybe again, some sort of slightly 101. What are the key drivers of evolution? Is it survival and propagation, effectively?
Well, let's use an example from England. Experiments showed that there was a change in the coloration of moths after the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, there was this coating of coal soot over everything, and the moths that survived had a darker coloration. So there was a selective advantage, an evolutionary pressure for the darker moths to survive, and the lighter ones, which are more visible, got picked off by predators. So generally in evolution, look at it two ways. Evolutionary pressure would come from local conditions. What predators are around, what diseases are around, what traits might offer an advantage in survival. And then there's the human factor. Humans have taken cannabis and made it quite unlike it might have been. And one byproduct of that is we've ended up with a situation where almost all cannabis available is high in THC and high in myrcene, whereas in the past, it was much more biochemically diversified than that. And it's only been in the last 10 or 12 years that there's been a big push universally to look for more cannabidiol, let alone other so-called minor cannabinoids. But the plant is much more biochemically diverse than it's become. A lot of this is a byproduct of prohibition. Certainly, if we look at prohibition in the United States of alcohol, it's true that there was beer during prohibition, but was primarily available was so-called bathtub gin. So this is a distilled product. If you're dealing with something that is illegal and heavy, like a bottle of booze would be, you want it to be as strong as possible so that less of it provides the service. So, it's better to have moonshine than it is low alcohol beer or wine. But the same applies to cannabis. And what we've seen, although it's true to say in decades past that there were high potency cannabis chemovars available, the average potency was much less than it is now. So there's been this steady increase in average potency. And to a certain extent, that's what people want, at least in the recreational market.
Yeah, I mean, look, you've very nicely moved on to the next section I was going to talk about, and that is the human involvement in it. And does human intervention form part of evolution, particularly with something like plants, where humans are able to manipulate them in such a fashion? And this is not just unique to cannabis, it's any kind of crop. Would you say that the things that humans have done have changed the evolution of cannabis?
Sure, absolutely. But, again, we've given one example of how this can be bad, really making cannabis chemovars somewhat homogeneous with a high THC, high myrcene. But let's give another example. Because of the necessarily clandestine nature of cannabis culture in recent decades due to prohibition, people got really excited about the plants from Afghanistan because instead of being 3-4 meters or more tall, they could be 1 or 2 meters and grown indoors under lights. So that was an advantage. But as everybody knows, Afghanistan is an arid environment. And so these plants suddenly were put in humid rooms indoors and were much more susceptible to fungal contamination. And so that's a problem. And those plants were not really adapted to that kind of environment indoors with high humidity, and problems have resulted. So this is exactly the antithesis of what we might see in natural cannabis breeding. In decades past, there were what were called cannabis land races. These would be types of cannabis that were grown in one area for many generations. So say Thailand, India, Nepal, Colombia. So these plants were adapted to local conditions, the soil, the available predators, the humidity, all these factors. So they were better adapted and, as best we know, showed a great deal of biochemical diversity as compared to what we're seeing today. So one movement is to try and reincorporate some of these land races, if they can be found, back into breeding programs. Unfortunately, what has happened is that the land races in many of these traditional cannabis growing areas have been supplanted by seeds from the Netherlands and from California, which are the high THC, high myrcene varieties. Mm. And, it's basically a matter of the farmers knew this is what the market wanted rather than what might really have been good for people or what was really adapted to the local conditions. So we hope that this is a remediable situation, but certainly a lot of what was there has been lost, and it's a question as to whether it can be regained in any fashion.
Yeah, I mean, is it possible to not reverse engineer or, retrace the steps or, I'm not a botanist. So.
I mean, the really greatest hope is that there are people that have saved the seeds or actually grown these things in their previous state for some period of time. And through some of our work, we're aware of breeders who do have these select cannabis chemovars that either are the same plants that were the land races in Afghanistan, for example, or closely descended from them. And I've seen a few samples with analysis, and they're very different to what we commonly see. For example, most often you see a lot of THC and not much of anything else. And some of these samples, you see a broad range of cannabinoids. And again, THC may be predominant, but you see decent amounts of several other phytocannabinoids. So this really may present big advantages therapeutically. We're seeing more and more research findings that indicate better results in the lab and even clinically with more diversified samples. So it is a demonstration of the so-called entourage effect, that even small amounts of these other compounds may really influence the result. And again, that remains a concept. It's controversial in some circles. We're doing our best to prove it out.
Yeah, the point about diversity is a really interesting one. And would you be able to kind of say why diversity is good? Is it gives you a better, wider toolkit to be able to deal with stuff? Is that kind of the essence of it?
Sure. Well, let's use an example from humans. Someone has an infection, ideally you've got one antibiotic that takes care of it. However, often that's not sufficient. You need multiple prongs of attack, so to speak, and so several drugs might be used simultaneously so that you get the quick kill of the bacteria, prevent the development of resistance. And another example would be cancer. Commonly, when people have a new cancer diagnosis, they're treated with a cocktail of different drugs. In complex diseases, it's not enough generally to have one molecule that's going to cover all the bases. Cannabis, because of its diversity of ingredients and their differing mechanisms of action, presents polypharmacy in one preparation. Put that in more simple terms, there are lots of different ingredients that can boost one another's therapeutic effects or reduce side effects associated with THC, for example, and this presents an advantage over a single molecule. And this is the reason that it's my contention that none of these synthetic cannabinoids, the single drugs, are ever going to have the therapeutic potential of properly constituted cannabis extract with multiple different active ingredients.
Yeah. So let's say we can't get that, or it's very difficult to get that from a landrace just because of, a long time of selective breeding, and perhaps we've lost access to those original seeds, etc. Can we kind of do it after the fact? So can we make a recipe of cannabinoids and terpenes?
Yeah, this certainly is possible, and I've seen it done. There are various breeding programs which have increased the diversity and provided types of cannabis that would have goodly amounts of 4 different phytocannabinoids and smaller amounts of many more, and have terpenoid profiles that are really different from the myrcene dominant profile that we see so commonly. So yes, it can be done. It's just that there was such good material available. Admittedly, some of this wasn't quite as potent as what the market insists on today. However, there were some really good traits out there that were ignored, again, as a result of prohibition.
Okay, so, it's quite clear that given sort of relentless selective breeding to enhance or to accentuate THC content, and then I guess myrcene as well, because it gives you the heavy stoned effect that you talked about on the last show. And these are kind of, the market sees these as a desirable quality. So, growers have moved towards trying to produce plants that have more of those qualities. If we step back to sort of before we were doing that, would the plant effectively, I think you talked about it on the last show, but the plant wants to make itself more attractive to humans because humans move around, and it means that they'll kind of propagate in more territory, if you like. Is that kind of a evolutionary aspect of it?
Maybe. It's really easy to anthropomorphize this. I don't know enough about the consciousness of the cannabis plant to say that it knows that we're trying to spread it around. However, evolution has a way of capitalizing on these relationships. And, this is the way that symbiosis works in nature. Generally speaking, species have different priorities, but if they find common purpose, they tend to find a way to work together. And certainly that's happened between humans and cannabis. But you can say the same thing of any cultivated crop. But it really gets into a philosophical kind of deal. When we're talking about domesticated animals that we use as food, certain people say that, well, they wouldn't be there but for the fact that we're breeding them for our own use. But one hopes that they're not exploited and that there isn't wasting of resources, and that we properly reverent for the relationship. Anyway, that's more philosophy than science.
One for another deeper chat, I think. And so, okay, that's on the plant side, I suppose. But do we know much about the human endocannabinoid system? Maybe let's focus on that. Has that evolved over time? Are we discovering new receptors and stuff? I don't,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But, if we look at us compared to other species, yeah, there are differences. CB1, so the cannabinoid receptor 1, that's responsible for the psychoactivity of THC and its antiemetic qualities and its muscle relaxant qualities, and a lot of that is pretty preserved in between species. With CB2, it's really different. And there's a lot of heterogeneity, differences in the structure, the sequence of CB2 in between species. And there actually are species in which we see different forms of CB2 in different organs. Now, this makes it incredibly confusing because you can have a situation where a certain drug will work one way on CB2 in one species and an opposite way in another species. Okay, and so this is a reason that in advanced research, there's generally an effort to make sure that the CB2 being used in the experiments is human CB2. And there are actually ways of introducing human CB2 into animal cells so that when you're testing a drug on it, you can get a result that would be the same as you expect in a human. So evolutionarily, there's been this big difference in CB2, and it may be a reflection of different immune susceptibilities or different immune needs, because that different species are subject to different types of attack. And again, going back to COVID, humans get COVID. It's apparent now that monkeys do, maybe that tigers do, but aren't really made very sick by it. And apparently dogs can carry it, but don't get sick with it. And, there's some viruses that adapt to different species and others that are solely stuck with one species. So it gets really complicated and everything has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, well, we could go into one there, really, couldn't we? As we move towards the end, I think I was more going to talk about sort of where we are now. And my kind of crude analysis of it is, plants back in the day were, we used them as medicine before the advent of sort of wide-scale pharmaceutical sort of industry, let's say. We used them as our medicine, and presumably plants that grew in India were suited for people, we used for medicine, were suited for people of an Indian physiology, let's say, as opposed to someone in Canada.
Yeah, well, boy, that gets into a really controversial area. In the 19th century, when, O'Shaughnessy was an Irish physician who went to Calcutta, now Kolkata, circa 1838, he began to study cannabis. A couple of years later, he came back to England, and cannabis, Indian hemp so-called, was really introduced to Western medicine because previously they'd been using hemp, European hemp, which would have been low potency, CBD predominant. There was a lot of conjecture at that time of different reactions between white people and the people of India and their reactions to cannabis. But you have to take into account that it probably took 3 months by ship to get the cannabis from India to England, and it would lose potency in the meantime. Anyway, there absolutely are individual differences in how people will react to a given dose of cannabis, but this, I would maintain, is related to tolerance, if any, how much has the person used this before, and then underlying endocannabinoid tone, which is a concept that we discussed, but is a little bit hard to measure. It would be a reckoning of the amount of endocannabinoids in someone's brain or otherwise in the system, the density of the receptors, whether they're active or inactive, and the activity of the enzymes that make them and break them down. So none of these things are easily measured. We can do serum endocannabinoid levels. We can even do them on the cerebrospinal fluid, but that's invasive. We don't have scans of the brain that tell you. So yeah, I can say there are differences between individuals, but I have not seen anything that indicates to me that there are differences based on nationality.
Right. It was more, I guess, environment and diet and those things will be different across different and not just different currently, but over many, many generations of humans, right?
Okay, yeah. Let's use another example. The standard Western diet is very pro-inflammatory and doesn't vaguely resemble what humans ate in the past. So particularly the American diet, we've got very heavy on carbohydrates and pro-inflammatory fats. particularly trans fats, which now are being eliminated, fortunately. This is a really bad thing for the microbiome of the gut, which to me seems to be the major regulator of endocannabinoid tone. So let's compare that with people eating a more traditional diet that was anti-inflammatory and would be heavy on prebiotics and probiotics, so fermented foods and a lot of vegetable matter that would be feedstock for beneficial bacteria in the gut. Somebody on a traditional diet is going to have better endocannabinoid tone. They would be less subject to chronic pain. They would be certainly less subject to getting autoimmune diseases, which are now rampant in Western societies. So this is a place where environment definitely enters into it. Yeah, as a major factor in how what their overall health is going to be and what their reaction will be to medications.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads on nicely sort of towards the end of this. I mean, again, my crude understanding is that over the last sort of 100 years, we've moved away from plants and we have moved more towards synthetic compounds, whether that's in food or in medicines that we take, but maybe also in shower products, soap, all kinds of different things, right? Therefore, plants, because that's been a substantial amount of time, a lot of the things in our bodies aren't very natural. Does that mean plants are no longer the sort of perfect antidote to that because we've kind of created a new problem?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think we really need to get back into more phytotherapy, plant-based medicine. And it remains the case for probably a preponderance of people in the world that plants remain a source of medicine. And if we look carefully at what is in modern pharmacopoeias, so many of the drugs are isolates or semi-synthetics based on plant drugs. So again, we've had the situation of coevolution. I don't know how much instinct is yet left in humans, but certainly indigenous people are well aware of the plants in their environment to treat certain diseases. And I can tell you from personal experience, working with the Machiguenga tribe in the Peruvian Amazon, that they were profoundly adapted to their local environment. In just a couple of months, we documented over 500 medicinal plants that they used, which were quite effective. Most things that ailed them. They had lousy resistance to Western infectious diseases, but in terms of the things that were natural to their environment, they had a way of dealing with most medical problems. Give you an example. When I came to the place we were staying, there had been a Peruvian doctor, Western trained, who was treating a young lady for a lesion on her nose from leishmaniasis, a parasitic disease. She was getting an antimonial. So that's a metal that's toxic to leishmaniasis organisms, but it's toxic to humans as well. So we finished her treatment, and I found that the people there had their own treatment from this plant root, and it was probably a lot safer than what we were giving her. Fortunately, she seemed to do well during the time I was there. So modern medicine doesn't have all the answers, and a look back at what our ancestors would do in this situation can be very illuminating.
Yeah, 100%. And actually quite nicely leads to sort of my final question. So, and I hope this isn't impertinent, but you talked quite nicely last time about how you'd grown up and studied in the kind of normal Western medical kind of sphere and understood that. And then you came to realize that a lot of stuff that you're prescribing wasn't actually helping people, and that led you to look more at the botanical area as an area of interest to you. Where do you draw the line? Because obviously you're, a researcher using kind of Western methods in many respects. Where do you draw the line between being an advocate of plant medicine versus the research you do, which inevitably would probably be meaning focusing on one or two compounds, etc.?
Well, I hope not on the latter. I think, as with so many things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. I like to be eclectic in my outlook on therapeutics, meaning that we should take the best of modern medicine with the best from traditional medicine. So the approach to a given individual might represent a combination of both. As another example, when people are using cannabis to treat cancer, we always recommend they do this in conjunction with conventional approaches, whether it be chemotherapy or radiation treatment, because we know already the best results come from these combination approaches rather than one or the other alone.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
complementary medicine is the way I would describe it.
Great. I like that. A sort of pick and mix approach of best of both worlds. And I mean, the things that we've learned about plant medicine is, let's take cannabis as the prime example, because we're obviously here to talk about that. But with something with over 500 different compounds in it, potentially, that's simply too many things to kind of monitor, right? And I guess on today's kind of standards, right, that'd be quite complex to really isolate what's doing what in something that big, I assume. But is therefore a part of plant medicine an appreciation of the unknown, or do we really need to isolate what is doing what?
Well, yeah, from a scientific standpoint, that's very useful. But again, we have abundant evidence now that these combinations are often much more beneficial than single compounds. And so my interest is in finding these best combinations. And you're right, it might be that we're most interested in a few components, but to get approval, such as by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, you have to account for almost everything. You'll be looking at gas chromatography, mass spec, and all these things, and you have to be able to show that your preparation is consistent over time, and it may involve hundreds of different compounds. So yes, this makes botanical medicine, particularly for development as a pharmaceutical, it's much more complicated. However, it has been done with Sativex and Epidiolex, and it can be done again with other cannabis components or preparations, particularly extracts, which I think offer the best opportunities for good, safe, and useful medicines.
Yeah, absolutely. And lots more exciting things to come. Well, cool. Ethan, thank you so much for joining me again. This is really great. And I have no doubt when I'm editing this show, I'll have another 50 ideas, which I'll email you about. But thanks again. This has been so useful to everyone who's listening, and it'll be great to speak to you again as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.